And thank you all for joining us today. With me is Richard Fields in the middle and John Cameron down at the other end. Gentlemen, Trump is eventually, apparently, going to sign this relief bill that's loaded with all kinds of nonsense. My favorite one.
No, he signed it last night.
He signed it.
He actually signed it last night. I didn't see. Maybe I went to bed early. No, I didn't go to bed early. I was doing something last night, so I didn't actually catch that. Great. Well, he signed it, but I'm not sure if that's a good news. It's good news for the unemployed, I suppose. They get some unemployment benefits, but for the rest of it,
it's bad news for everybody. I mean, if you get the $900, it's going to cost you $2,700, and if you're making I think $75,000 a year, you get jack. So it's just bad news for everybody.
Yeah, and there's so much unrelated stuff. They've got now it's a federal crime to stream pirate movies. Apparently, there's all kinds of goofy. Yeah, there's all kinds of goofy things that they put in.
Lots of money for gender studies in Pakistan. I mean, it's just a congressional grab bag that makes no sense on any level whatsoever. Particularly since the government has no money. Everything they're spending on this so-called stimulus is borrowed, and it's borrowed from the Fed, who creates it, ready to use without actually having been earned. It's a recipe for future inflation that is an absolute certainty at this point. Certainly, there's going to be inflation for sure in the stock and bond market, which will simply increase the divide between rich and poor. And later on, there will probably be inflation in consumer prices, which will again hurt the poor, in comparison to the wealthy.
Well, I normally hate to agree with Richard. No, we agree on a lot of things, and I call this thing the scamulus rather than the stimulus. I like to come up with. I amuse myself by coming up with other names for things, and really the idea that government can fix things by creating money out of thin air, and the only thing that really does is add to the debt burden of future generations and make our fiat currency even more worthless is crazy. And then the fact that there used to be a difference, or at least a stated difference, between the Republicans and the Democrats on the fiscal side, but maybe that's disappeared with Goldwater. I don't know where
it's disappeared. Yeah, it disappeared after Goldwater, and it's been totally 180-degree reversed with Trump. I mean, Trump was, when he was having his little snit fit, saying he wouldn't sign it, he was calling for $2,000 going directly to everybody, with I think 600 for the kids.
I think the logic of that there is a tiny.
There's no logic.
Spark. Well, bear with me for 30, 45 seconds. Would you rather take this money that they're creating out of thin air and put it in the hands of the deep state or any state and have them spend it as they see fit, or put it in the hands of the consumers who are going to have to pay the bill anyway and have them spend it as they
take your choice fit? You get poor by having consumer price go up really quickly, or you get relatively poor by having stock prices go up and you don't have any stocks. That's the choice.
Yeah.
Well, the real reason the stimulus bill is as complicated and convoluted as it is because all that campaign cash has to get paid back somehow. Yes. And I think that's what the real reason, all that junk, the real reason there's the entertainment industry gets a favor thrown in there for no reason. It's why we can't get a clean bill. And it's because people pay so we don't get a clean bills. So moving on, New Mexico has abolished asset forfeiture. I can speak this morning. I really can. 5 years ago, everybody predicted crime would soar, but it didn't. So we actually have a working case here where civil asset forfeiture does not work. Man, I cannot say that today.
Civil asset forfeiture is simply a way for police departments and municipalities and whoever runs a police department to enrich themselves without ever having to prove guilt on people who shouldn't have to be proved guilty anyway, namely people who use so-called illegal substances. The whole idea that the government can determine what kind of medicine you can take and steal all your stuff if you take the wrong kind of medicine is absurd on its face. That said, as far as reducing the so-called crime of drug use, doesn't do it. That's what the statistical empirical evidence compiled by the IJID, the Institute for Justice, has proven without any question. They compared New Mexico with some surrounding states, including Texas, and found that there is no statistical difference between New Mexico, which quit asset forfeiture, and Texas, and I think it was, I don't know, Oklahoma or someplace where they did the asset forfeiture is still going hot and heavy.
Well, I don't know, Richard, do you remember, or do you know, or James, do you know? Because I don't remember when asset forfeiture actually assumed a legal mantle. Because there used to be that when cops took money from your pocket and put it in their own, it was called theft, and they got written up and fired for it. And now it's a formal process. When did it become formal? Do you remember the court case?
I don't know. Obviously, it became a thing after the drug war became a thing, which was Nixon era. Nixon famously, or Haldeman, his right-hand man, famously said that the reason we are conducting a drug war is because we're going after the blacks by making drugs illegal, and this is an easy way to do it. And the rest is history.
Well, remember the excuses. It goes back to as far as prohibition and the fighting the mob. It's all about, they're going after the kingpins. We're not going to care about the little guy. We don't care about the little guy. We're just going to go after the mobs. But of course, those guys have money and lawyers. It's the poor people don't. So they end up going after the poor. And then they wonder why the community has such a distrust of police. This whole things are tied together, and no one wants to think about the more complex issues.
On a happier note, we're looking at a really quite optimistic future when it comes to drugs that are now illegal, including hallucinogens, psilocybin and LSD and other drugs that do have, contrary to what the federal government says, do have medical uses, are being legalized at the state level, and in some cases with some pretty demonstrable positive benefits for people who have mental problems that have not been able to be addressed with traditional medicine.
Well, and then on top of that, the pot legalization, even though the states have again tried to screw it up by taxing it out of existence, I think, and especially here in California, where they put some pretty exorbitant barriers to people going into a pot store and using it. There's all sorts of people out there using CBD, and apparently, CBD with a tiny little bit of THC in it. For some reason, the THC opens up the receptors so that CBD works better for joint pain and all the rest of that. And I haven't seen, unfortunately, because the pot is still illegal at the federal level. You can't really get good studies out there because the only place you can go to get the stuff legally at the federal level is but this one farm where they turn on a crap product, which I can't say today, James. So the idea, again, Richard stated very, very clearly, the idea that you make some medicine legal and other medicine illegal. One of the things that we have such a huge regulatory state, the Food and Drug Administration and others regulate everything that's even remotely tangential to being a medicine or a food or anything else, and what's ever in their favor for some reason gets a free ride, and what they don't like vaping, and they put huge barriers to it. In National Health in England is very, very pleased about the reduction in emphysema and lung disease and all the rest of that they're seeing by promoting vaping and the number of people that are cutting down on smoking. So it's everybody's got a dog in a fight, and the more things that are illegal, and the more laws that are on the books, the more courts you need, the more cops you need, the more prisons you need, and like the anyway, I'm starting to ramble, but it's pretty straightforward. The as Richard pointed out, the intended consequence for this whole thing was stated pretty clearly in the 60s, and it's not talked about, which is to take one class of people, one demographic segment, and make their lives miserable and fill the prisons with them. And that's led to all sorts of horrible downstream results. So bad. Legalize it all. Let people make good choices. Yeah.
Well, talking about legalizing things and making good choices, the California runs out of reasons, excuses essentially, for the lockdowns to continue, because despite the lockdowns, California is now the leading epicenter of the coronavirus cases. We've done the lockdowns, we've done the masking for months, and yet the surge comes. And as we think we talked about a few weeks ago, when the judge asked for the evidence, these lockdowns, well, I think he specifically asked for outdoor dining. Why would outdoor dining be banned? They didn't come with any. They didn't have any scientific evidence that the lockdowns work.
Well, and they admitted flat out that the reason they put outdoor dining on the list was to keep people from in their homes instead of traveling. The numbers out of New York say 1.6% of their cases were traced to dining in general. And that, I don't think I think that was indoor dining. So there was no reason specifically for outdoor dining to be banned. It was simply they wanted people to have fewer places to go. And so if you have fewer places to go outside dining, what you're going to do is have people over to your house inside. They're going to have, lots of chips and salsa and tequila and beer and watch the football game without masks on, chest bumping, high-fiving, all that good stuff you do when you're watching either the Lakers or the Dodgers win something, because LA is the epicenter for this thing. And if you take away a perfectly healthy outside option, outside dining, not only do you kill off a whole bunch of restaurants and a whole bunch of jobs, but you force people inside where the chances of transmitting the virus are much higher. So, it's a typical government stupid, one size fits none approach to everything they do. And we're seeing it. But if you look at the CDC said that 10 times as many people have the virus as have tested positive or tested for actually tested for antibodies, then you're looking at an IFR of an infection fatality rate of about 0.1%, which brings into question why they're doing any of this stuff at all. But
there is no question other than it was first of all, it was a way for politicians on the left to make life difficult for Trump. That's fine. I don't have any interest in keeping Trump in office. But now they've kind of, it's gotten ahead of them. They have to believe their own phony narrative, which is that although the shutdowns work, they don't. There's no empirical evidence whatsoever that the shutdowns have any effect whatsoever in stopping the spread of the virus. This is not the question that the virus can be lethal for people who have preconditions or have other comorbidities, but lockdowns that don't work.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to
say, CDC. Sorry, go ahead.
No,
James.
I was going to point out that when this whole first thing started, we were talking about 3 million deaths, and we're ended up at 300,000. And so if we look at context, if we remember what we were afraid of at the beginning, we're actually nowhere near that. And we've all forgotten that we were looking in the millions of dead when we started, and now we're in the hundreds of thousands, which is actually something we're competent to deal with. It's not something outside the range of things that human society has dealt with before. It's kind of,
and that they're saying that that they're looking at COVID and they're coming up with those number of deaths, not necessarily from people's blood that they're analyzing in hospitals, but they're looking at the number of excess deaths this year, which is at 15% over last year, and assuming that that's from COVID. So the problem with that is that they're discounting all the excess deaths associated with the lockdowns. and much less the lives that are ruined forever. The business is gone. The transfer of, that it's bad here, but in third world countries where people were teetering on the edge and relying on international commerce to trickle down some income for them, it's even worse, because upwards of 150 million of those people are being pushed into the most extreme form of poverty by this, and way more than 300,000 of them are going to die. So anyway, we beat this thing to death. It's a bad government policy that, it's like the drug war. Once you get it started, you can't get off the bandwagon, because how are you going to turn down all the money from the police unions and the correctional officers unions and all the lawyers? You just can't. Once you get used to spending that, it's kind of like asset forfeiture.
Yeah. Well, in San Francisco, they reported there's twice as many drug overdose deaths as COVID deaths. I think suicides are up about twice. They've doubled. Suicides have doubled. So that excess deaths is not all COVID deaths. There was a story in Politico this weekend or last week about why Democrats keep losing rural counties. How Democrats in this last election, they took a hammering outside of the central cities. And there's a reckoning, well, at least with some aspects of the Democrat Party, about how this is happening. And people are trying to come to grips with why this has exactly happened. And, you guys have any thoughts?
Well, I have a thought. I think the difference between rural people, and I grew up rural, I grew up on a farm, and people who have never set foot on a farm, people who have lived in New York or San Francisco or LA or Chicago or whatever for their entire life, and the only view of a farm is looking out an airplane window. I think the difference is that people don't realize where their food is coming from. I remember an anecdote about somebody talking about being in favor of shutting down the Central Valley in order to save the smelt, saying I'm not worried about where my food comes from, so I just go to Safeway. So there's a lack of understanding about where food comes from, where how the world actually works in terms of the food chain. That being the case, farmers, they know where their food comes from. They know that they have to be out there working. They know that they have to sell into a market that is in large part controlled by monopolistic organizations, which are protected. The monopolies are protected in effect by the federal government. So there's an awful lot of thought in rural counties that things aren't right, and the promises from the Democrats never come through. Let's give the Republicans a chance. That's where it's coming from.
And I think I read that Politico article, James, and I think the article missed the boat completely, because they were the person who was like first person self-interview in the article. It's an op-ed piece. Was on the left and a progressive, and talked about how, again, the things that Richard mentioned, that the Dems makes promises and they show up for photo ops around election time, but the rest of the time they ignore the farmers. Actually, they don't ignore the farmers. What they do the rest of the time is support organizations and support policies and support regulations that make farmers' jobs harder and harder and harder and harder. And I don't know about Wisconsin, but I do know about California from talking to a huge number of ag business owners when I used to be in development or fundraising, and they will flat out tell you that they now employ people full time, whereas it was a part-time, a few hours a week job before. They employ a number of people, if they have any size operation at all, 2+ people, to simply take care of the paper trail and the regulations. It's gotten so bad that if somebody wants to actually use a perfectly legal fertilizer, a fertilizer they can buy at their local feed store, and a different fertilizer than they're normally using, they have to fill out forms and get approval from the local farm regulatory agency to actually use a different fertilizer. So on and on and on and on. And so the people on farms know flat out that the Dems are interested in environment first, food second, regulation first, commerce second, and that wasn't even mentioned in the article. And so I don't think there's any way for the Dems, because they're not going to change their spots. They're not going to talk about less regulation. They're not going to get off their high horse about environmental policies that are actually destroying more animals than helping them out. It's a lost cause for them. There's nothing they can do. They can put people on the streets. They can have the president come and visit and everything else. But the reality is the Democratic Party is anti-farm, anti-farmer, anti-farm owner. And thinking that somehow farmers don't care about the land, this is their only asset that they're going to pass on to future generations to just sustain their wealth. Why would they not care about the land? Okay, I'm off that soapbox now. We can go on to something else.
Well, I think from my kind of perspective is, it's as much a cultural attitude as anything else. If you listen to the city people talk about the culture of the rural people, it's essentially hate speech. And and if you don't think that they hear you,
if
you don't hear,
because they vote for Trump, they're stupid.
Well, it's flyover country.
Yeah.
And it's flyover country, and people get tired of being thought of as flyover country. But going back to hate speech, the suppression of hate speech has driven more and more users of social media onto different platforms.
Yay.
You've got Parler, Minds, MeWe. There's Locals. There's all kinds of new social platforms, and I guess they're starting to gain strength. I think MeWe hit 9 million people now, so there's actually starting to hit a critical mass where they may have some hope of actual competition.
Well, that's good and bad. It's good in the sense that competition is always good. It's bad that the competition is in essence forced by the government by essentially blackmailing the Facebooks and Twitters and Googles of the world to say, you either censor according to our dictates or we'll regulate the hell out of you. That's what's happening. And it's bad that in the sense that this will provide even more impetus to repeal Section 230, which is the regulation that prevents the government from imposing, from treating platforms as publishers. In other words, if a platform is liable for whatever scurrilous thing an user says, they're in essence going to be required to self-censor to the extent that the platform becomes simply another plain vanilla ABC, CBS, or NBC. That's what the politicians want. They want a media that's as malleable, that they can control. For a while, the internet was something other than that. They're reining it in. I wish Parler and the rest as much luck as they deserve, but I'm sure that they will eventually follow or be required to knuckle under to the same political pressures as the giants are now.
I want to add something to what Richard said, and that's that there's the rise of these alternative platforms just happens to be happening at a time where these media platforms are saying, yes, we need censor, we need government regulation, we need regulation. So what normally happens then when the mass of people who have the biggest dogs in the fight start facing competition, they turn to the government to regulate them with the phony promise that this is going to make for a less biased, less hate-filled speech platform. And what will happen is that the regulations will end up favoring the existing platforms and preventing new platforms from starting, because they won't have the resources to do the self-censoring. I'm going to call it self-censoring, basically what it is. That was supposed to be air quotes, but I didn't get my fingers on the screen. What it is mind speak. What it is just lamestream media, only instead of on a TV, it's or radio, it's on your laptop. So this is going to benefit the big boys and keep the little guys from being able to compete. That's the way it always works.
And it will quell any kind of dissent to the official government line, whether it's Democrat or Republican. Doesn't make any difference. Whoever's in power will control what's said on the media implicitly.
Well, all the free airtime and all the free media that the political parties get, it gets paid back. It's It simply does. The host, speaking of New York media, the host of the Daily Clouds, New York Times, they got a Pulitzer Prize. I guess they had to turn it back in because they really butchered this sulfate thing. I only caught part of it. And so any of you guys catch one of this thing? The New York Times had to do this big mea culpa.
The caliphate, the New York Times was guilty of not following the simple rules of journalists. They didn't check their source. This fella in Canada made up this story about being an ISIS hitman, executioner for ISIS, and there's lots of back scratching going on, the people in the show and all the rest of that. They didn't bother to check, and then instead of doing a complete retraction, they just said, well, only part of it's wrong, but the show is. And so it's the typical, the gray lady, used to be known for wonderful journalism, and now, she's, her clothes are tattered and she's doing a bad job as well. So the whole 80% of the show was made up of whole cloth by this one guy who claimed to be an ISIS hitman. Turned out he'd never belonged to ISIS, never went to the places that he said he did, and apparently the Canadian government is prosecuting for lying about being a terrorist, which is weird. Again, just bad journalism, as we're seeing everywhere and more.
Well, you can be biased without being unethical. There's nothing wrong with expressing your bias, expressing your perspective, but you should be able to do it with ethics, especially if you're going to sit around and say that you're a journalist and you're the highest ethics of journalism. There should be some realism in there somewhere.
Yeah, and I'd like to see.
There's two problems here. One is ethics, and one is laziness. The first problem was laziness. They didn't check their sources. That's real. Simple rule number one in journalism: make sure you check your sources and get verification from multiple sources before you run with a story. And the second thing they did is once their error, their laziness was caught out, then they tried to cover their tracks in a very unethical way.
Well, we got a few seconds left. I want to wish everybody a happy new year. I think, it's been a tough 2020, man. I think 2021, we have a lot to look forward to. I want to thank everybody at Access Sacramento. I want to thank John and Richard for continuing the Libertarian Counterpoint this year. It was we've faced some challenges, but we've managed to get through. And I want to thank everybody for watching. And from those of us here at Libertarian Counterpoint, thanks and good night.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, and thank you all. I appreciate the work that you guys have been doing. Yeoman's work.
And please, with that thing, please remember to love everybody.